Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing Plato's Euthyphro. The story of philosophy as we understand it, begins with Plato. Plato kind of shapes our very comprehension of what philosophy is. And Socrates, the main kind of interlocutor, the main kind of exposer, the one that when the voices Plato's opinions, becomes the voice of philosophy. And a very influential dialogue that Plato wrote is the Euthyphro. So we'll be looking at some of the main reasons why this article is this dialogue is very influential. And the main is that something arises out of it, something that has been known as the Euthyphro's dilemma. And it's a crucial dilemma that becomes a theoretical tool for understanding a lot of things elsewhere as well, a lot of normative notions elsewhere. So let us begin with the Euthyphro. So again, the Euthyphro is an enormously influential dialogue. Some people nowadays, if you go to some, like even top universities, you go to Oxford, you go to Princeton, you take a class in philosophy, and there will be some people, some philosophers, that would point to Euthyphro, that will cite Euthyphro as a definitive refutation of a particular way of thinking about morality as grounded in God. As we'll see later on, the Euthyphro dilemma challenges a particular way of thinking about morality grounded in God. And Plato's dialogue was so influential that even contemporary people thinking that that's it, that's the definitive answer to the question whether morality can rest on God. The answer is no, it cannot, they would say. So that's controversial, but at the very least, it illustrates how powerful this very ancient dialogue has been. Another great reason for reading the Euthyphro carefully is that it's a great example of philosophy as dialectics, as engaging in dialogue with other people for the sake of attaining truth. So it has the following structure. There's a basic philosophical question, it's followed by an attempted answer, and then an assessment of the answer, and the cycle continues. The listener, the proponent of the answer listens to the assessment, tries to modify it accordingly, and so on. So there's this dynamic of trying to pursue truth by using reason in the context of a dialogue. It is a good instance or good manifestation of philosophy as a dialogue between persons aimed at truth. And as we'll see shortly, Euthyphro sometimes has some very good philosophical moments, but it's always Socrates, the one that is consistently philosophical, that is consistently pursuing truth, and is willing to be shown false in his beliefs, is willing to contemplate, to look at the possibility that he's mistaken. Euthyphro, as we'll see at the end of the day, ends up not doing that, but he does have some very good philosophical moments. But it is Socrates that manifests how to be a philosopher well. And again, part of what it is to treat someone as a dialogue partner is to recognize that they have a kind of legitimacy in the participation of the dialogue, that their opinions, their experiences, that the evidence they bring forth should be listened to, should be given a fair hearing, that they happen to clash with or disagree with what we antecedently believe is not a good reason for rejecting them. It's the persuasiveness of the reasons being put forth by this interlocutor that should be driving the dialogue. That is what good, pure philosophy is and should do. And Socrates is a great example of this. So again, part of what it is to treat someone as a person in dialogue is to recognize that their perspective is not inferior to our own. They're equal participants in this task that we're undertaking. We should not think of ourselves as privileged, as if someone disagrees with that, we can just dismiss them. To do that is to cease to pursue truth, to cease to care about pursuing truth. So Euthyphro, the dilemma, the dialogue itself is centered around the basic philosophical question: what is piety or holiness? And the basic sketch of the answer is something like, what's the right way of relating to God or the gods? It's like, how does one become a good son? Or what's by the right way of relating to one's father? So being a good son is kind of being pious, but being pious is a good relation towards the gods. So the basic question is, how does one relate to the gods in the rightful way? How is one a good, like, children of God, if that's the right way of putting it, or like someone who's created by God? How does one relate appropriately, well, justifiably, rightfully towards God? And to do that is to be pious. So what is it to do that? And Socrates begins the philosophical discussion by saying, so what is it the piety is? What is pious and what is impious? And by this stage in the dialogue, Euthyphro has asserted himself an expert on matters of piety and religious truths. He is a writer of poems. He's someone who tells stories about the gods, and in those stories, there are morals about how to be a good person, how to relate to the gods well, how to be pious. And Euthyphro says, I know what I'm talking about. I write this stuff. I'm an expert in the field of piety. And Socrates says, oh, wonderful. I need someone to enlighten me in these topics. So tell me, what is piety? And here's the first answer that Euthyphro gives to this question. And it kind of shapes the nature of philosophy. The way in which Socrates replies to this answer shapes what philosophy is. And here's what Euthyphro says. Well, now, I claim that the pious is what I'm doing now, and that he points to his particular action. And if you recall, what he's doing is he's going to the Athenian court, he's bringing charges against his own father. And he's bringing charges against his own father because his father neglected a servant. One of the servants fought another servant and ended up killing the other servant, and then the father noticed it, so he restrained the murderer, the servant that killed the other servant. He put him in the pit, he tied him down. He called for the relevant authority so they can go and make a case to decide what was the right thing to do, what the legal thing to do was. But in the meantime, the father neglected the servant and ended up dying of starvation in that, he was tied. So Euthyphro is now persecuting, bringing charges against his own father. So it's a very complicated case. It's not entirely obvious exactly how to proceed because of the complexity of the case. And yet Euthyphro seems sure of himself. He seems convinced that he knows what ought to be done. He knows what the right thing to do is. He knows what the pious thing to do is. And he's pointing to it. And like, oh, what I'm doing now is rightful, is pious, is the right way of relating to the gods. And here's how Socrates replied. And Socrates' reply to this answer by Euthyphro, again, shapes the nature of philosophy. Here's what Socrates says. So remember that I did not request this from you to teach me one or two of the many pious things, but to teach me the form itself by which everything pious is pious. In other words, Socrates is saying, wait a minute, don't just point to cases of piety. That's too simple of a task. I'm asking a much more difficult question. I'm asking a philosophical question. I'm asking for you to tell me the nature, the form, the definition of piety itself. What is piety itself? So here we get a kind of in a nutshell, the nature of philosophy. There's first a hard question that is put forth. What is piety? What is friendship? What is justice? What is goodness? And so on. So there's a basic question. And then Socrates says, pointing to examples is just not good enough. That's not a deep answer. A deep answer is articulating a nature, a form, a necessary definition. And what are those things? Well, they're the standard which settles the cases of the thing we're talking about, in this case, piety. So a proper answer to the philosophical question, what is piety, is one that provides the form or essence or nature or definition of piety. And that would be the standard which settles all cases of piety. It would also be what all cases of piety and only cases of piety have in common. It would be that in virtue of which cases of piety are cases of piety, that in virtue of which those cases are pious cases. So it is the thing that explains their status as pious that Socrates is after. That's a deep question. It's a hard question. And after Socrates said this in this dialogue, that's what philosophers do. We don't just point to examples. We try to articulate the nature or true definition of the notions we're talking about, like justice, goodness, beauty, truth, reality, hard questions. So we're looking for deep answers to those hard questions. So here Euthyphro has a good philosophical moment. He recognizes, he understands what Socrates is doing. And then he plays the game. He plays the philosophy game. He puts forth a legitimate possible answer, philosophical answer to the question, what is piety? And here's the first proposal. And this is now a philosophical proposal, a way of getting to the heart of what piety is. And it says, what is beloved by the gods is pious, and what is not beloved by them is impious. And Socrates is happy. Socrates is like, okay, good. Now you're being a philosopher. Now you're seeing the profundity of my questions and trying to answer them accordingly. So here's what Socrates says. Excellent, Euthyphro. With this, you have answered in the way in which I was looking for you to answer. In other words, you're being a philosopher, you're thinking about this, you're trying to answer hard questions. And then Socrates continues, whether your answer is true or not, I don't quite know. In other words, don't simply quickly take the answer as true. Try to think about it, try to assess it, look for reasons or evidence that try to justify that answer. And here's an objection that Socrates puts forth that seem to be a very serious objections to this proposal. And the context that Euthyphro is working with is the Athenian stories about gods, a multiplicity of gods that disagree with each other, that fight. And Socrates points out the gods themselves and the stories they're appealing to disagree. And they disagree about crucial matters. So much like humans, the Athenian gods do not disagree about basic empirical matters. How many cows are there in the field? How high is the table? Basic things you can just measure and answer. The Athenian gods, much like humans, disagree about things like the just and the unjust, the noble and the shameful, the good and the bad, moral questions, the pious and the impious. So Socrates points out, it seems that the gods themselves disagree about what is worthy of love. They love different things. So the gods' love cannot be the ground for piety. Why? Because they disagree about what is worthy of love. They love different things. So that cannot be an objective standard for piety. And Euthyphro has another philosophical moment. He realizes Socrates is right. That cannot be a good answer, as stated anyway. So he modifies the answer to accommodate the objection. Here's the second proposal that modifies the answer, that incorporates the objection and modifies the answer in such a way that is no longer subject to the objection. So the new proposal says, the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite what all the gods hate. So if there are cases, actions, policies, practices that some gods love and other hate, those are not counted as pious or impious. It is only the actions or policies or practices or institutions that all the gods love. Those are the pious ones. And the ones that all the gods hate, those are the impious. And Euthyphro still think that's what's going on. It is when all of the gods agree. And it's crucial to note that Socrates actually accepts a lot of this answer. He accepts that all the cases of piety are cases of being loved by the gods. And all the cases of being loved by the gods, by all of the gods, are cases of piety. So he accepts that the description, being loved by the gods, refers to only those things that are pious. And pious things are only those things that are loved by the gods. So much of the way of thinking about a proper philosophical answer to a question is being met by this philosophical answer. But in response to this comes the famous question that is the Euthyphro dilemma, that is an expression of the Euthyphro dilemma. And here's the famous question. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? So in my experience, some students immediately see the profundity of the question. In others, it takes a little bit longer. It takes saying that in different ways. It takes a couple of examples and so on. So if you're one of those that already gets the Euthyphro dilemma, wonderful, that's great. For the others, let's start looking at different ways of putting it. At some point, you're just going to see it, and let's make sure you see it. So let me put it in different words. Here's Euthyphro's dilemma. There are two options, and it appears two options only. That's why it's a dilemma. Either A, something is pious because it is loved by the gods. That's one option. Or B, something is loved by the gods because it is pious. And that's a very different option. Different way of saying A is to say that, or to ask, are things neither pious nor impious first? And then God's love for those makes them pious. It is God's love, according to A, that brings it about. The things that are pious are pious. To be loved by the gods, to be pious is to be loved by the gods. That's option A. That's one of the horns of the dilemma. Option B is the opposite, and the other horn. are pious things pious first, and then the gods love them because they are pious? According to option B, there is such a thing as being pious, and things are objectively pious. The gods look upon them and recognize that something is pious and love them because they're pious. So God's loves are the response to the objective piety that is there. If option B is the right way of thinking it, pointing to God's love does not explain piety precisely because God's love presupposes the objective thing that is pious to begin with. Um, Let me give you a couple more instances of the Euthyphro dilemma to give you a better way of understanding it and also seeing how it applies in multiple different areas, normative areas. So here's a case in the Bible, in the Old Testament. There's the case of Cain and Abel. So the description in the Old Testament, the Bible is very, very thin, very quickly. Things happen very quickly in the Old Testament. And here's the description we get. Both Cain and Abel go to the altar and make offerings to God. Each of them makes their relevant offerings. And then God loves or accepts or approves of Abel's offering, but not of Cain's offering. In the story continues that Cain gets very upset and goes and kills Abel and so on. That's how the story develops. We don't have to worry about the development of the story. For our purposes, we have to ask this question. And this gives rise to the Euthyphro dilemma, or a version of the Euthyphro dilemma. Why did God approve of or accepted Cain's offer and not, Abel's offering and not Cain's? The Bible does not tell us. It just says one offering, next offering, God approves of one, not the other one, and things continue. We do not know why God approves of one or the other. And that gives rise to the question, the Euthyphro question. There are two options, and it seems two options only. Either A, Cain's and Abel's offering were objectively indistinguishable prior to God's response. In other words, they did the same kind of offering. They had the same ritual, same intention, same motion, same kind of offering, the thing that they put forth. Objectively, they were indistinguishable prior to God responding to them. And then God's response, God's approving of Abel's and disapproving of Cain's, made Abel's offering pious and Cain's offering impious. In other words, option A, still the same option A, is the one in which there is no objective piety or holiness. God's response is what brings it about, what causes, what makes something that was previously not holy or pious become holy or pious, or its opposite. And that's option A. Option A, again, is Cain and Abel's offerings were indistinguishable. There was no difference between them objectively before God's response. God approving of one made it pious, and disapproving of the other one made it impious. God brought it about by his approving that one was pious and the other one impious. Option B is still the same option B. It says the opposite. Abel's offering, but not Cain, was pious first, was objectively worthy of love and approval. There's something about what Abel did, say the right intention, the right kinds of motions, the right kinds of dedication, the right kinds of offering, the thing that he brought forth. He did something objectively well. And Cain did something objectively wrong. He didn't care about it. He was just going through the motion. He had ulterior motives, something that objectively was impious. And anyone who knew enough could have noticed, right? This is prior to God responding. Abel did something well, something pious, and Cain did something wrong, something impious. And then when God showed up, he said, hey, he approved of Abel's reply precisely because it was objectively pious. And he disapproved of Cain's offering precisely because it was objectively impious. Again, option B does not explain piety in terms of God's responses. Option A does. Here's a third manifestation of Euthyphro's dilemma, and this is now abstracted away from God, just to give you a sense that it doesn't have to involve God. It just involves an agent doing something. So think of the ideal city. And I'm just going to define the ideal city as the city in which all of the rights of each of the members of the city are protected or enshrined by the laws. Every law is such that there's a corresponding right. So there are no superfluous laws, and there are no rights that are not being protected or enshrined by the laws of the ideal city. That's what makes it ideal. All the laws work out well by there being a correspondence between individual rights and those laws. But now we have the same question. Do people have rights? The members of society have rights because they are granted by the laws? Or are the laws written to protect already existing human rights, rights that are prior to, antecedent to the laws that are made? And this just is the Euthyphro dilemma, and we can put it in slightly different ways. Option A, which is the same A throughout, says that rights just are legal rights. The legislators bring it about by they're making a law that that rights exist. Think of women and their inability to vote not too long ago in the past, lamentably. Option A says that when the law was passed, that women were granted equal status and ability to vote, the legal right was created, but also the individual right was created. Women did not have the right, legal or otherwise, before that. The right was just brought about into existence by the law. That's option A. The legislators bring about the rights. Before that, when women were not allowed to vote, there was no right that was violated, because rights just are the result of legislation. That's A again. That's, except in this case, it's the legislators are playing the role of God, right? They're the ones that bring about the goodness. And B is again the same thing. B says, no. Rights are moral rights. They're grounded in human nature and some other things. And they're prior to, and they constrained legal systems. So the ideal city is ideal precisely because the written laws correspond and track antecedent, previously existing moral rights. Moral rights are prior to the laws. And the laws are just laws when and only when they track the individual rights that are there prior. There are wrong laws when they do not. So in the case of women having the ability to vote, when the law changed and now women had the ability to vote, the right was not created. It was recognized, it was protected. And before that, it was violated. The laws did not track the individual rights that women are equal and therefore have the equal capacity for political involvement in our society. That's option B. The legislators do not explain rights. They track rights. When they get it right, they're just laws. When they don't, they're unjust. But notice it's the same dilemma. So to conclude, I want to point out that there is a contemporary challenge that is applied to God. So if you're Christian, if you're theist, this applies to things you believe. So either A, something is good or right because God commands it, or B, God commands something because it is good or right. Notice the first option, God brings it about that something is right. Before God commanded it, it was not. So think of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill. According to option A, killing was not wrong before God said, thou shalt not kill. When God said, thou shalt not kill, then it became wrong. That's option A. God brought it about that killing was wrong. Option B says, no, killing is wrong. That's a moral fact. And God commands it precisely because God sees, he recognizes, he's receptive to the fact that killing is wrong. So he commands that which is right, but he doesn't bring it about that is right. But it seems that both of these options have some potential challenges for the believer. So on the one hand, if A is correct, if God just brings it about, then it seems that God is not all good. Applying goodness to God gets tricky if God just brings about goodness, whatever it is. God's will, if God's will is morally arbitrary, whatever God wills is right, then it seems vacuous to say, it seems uninformative to say God is good, because that just means God does what God does. And that seems to undermine God being good and being worthy of worship. That's problematic. On the other hand, if B is correct, if God is just responding to moral facts that are not of his own making, it seems to undermine or detract from God's omnipotence, ability to do anything. So if rightness or goodness are prior to God, it seems that rightness or goodness, morality constrains even God. And many theists have found that problematic. How can something that is not God constrain or limit God? It seems to limit his being omnipotent. In either case, it seems that either God's all goodness or all powerful omnipotence seems to be compromised. So this is a serious challenge. If you're interested about talking more about this challenge, let me know. I'll see you next time.